Hi, epistemologists. So today we're discussing the second part of our week on disagreement. And this time we'll be going over somebody who thinks that the right thing to do when you disagree is to conciliate. That is to say, to approximate more closely the degree of belief or the total belief of someone who disagrees with you if certain conditions are met, right? Like, we're not saying that anytime anybody disagrees with you, it's going to be like a crisis and you should change your belief. But a lot of the times, this is David Christensen in his 2007 article, The Epistemology of Disagreement, the good news. Christensen thinks that conciliating is the right thing to do in a lot of cases. And sometimes the thing that I should do if I believe something and you disbelieve it is to suspend my belief, and that's what you should do as well. And so Christensen is going to provide us with a roadmap for thinking about disagreement and for thinking about how it's going to be applied in a few different cases. So this should be fun. Strap in and let's get started. Christensen starts by saying that disagreement is an opportunity for epistemic self-improvement, and it's a kind of evidence about the possibility of my or my peers being wrong. So it's an opportunity for Christensen. I could be doing better. If someone disagrees with me, I have learned that. And so it's like I have a chance to do better than I had been doing. So for Christensen, it's going to turn out conciliation is the right response. Remember, conciliation is, again, getting my degree of belief or my belief to more closely approximate that of the person with whom I am disagreeing. One thing that comes up right away, especially since we just talked about steadfastness last time, is why not live and let live, right? Why conciliate and why not just let everybody have the opinion that they have, agree to disagree, and so on and so forth? Christensen says live and let live is hard to maintain. Here's a quote from Christensen that I find compelling on this point. Suppose that my friend and I are doctors in the same practice. One of my patients is in very serious condition, and my friend and I both examine him, study his medical records, read the relevant literature, and come to conflicting conclusions. There are, it turns out, just two theories that might explain his symptoms. Theory A is somewhat simpler, but theory B fits a bit better with the data. My friend has about 65% credence in B and 35% in A, while for me, the two figures are reversed. When my friend and I talk the case over as thoroughly as two intelligent people can ever discuss anything, we come to see that she is more moved by the fit with reported data, whereas I'm more moved by simplicity. I take it that this is at least one sort of case, somewhat different weightings of fully reasonable epistemic desiderata that make plausible the idea that rationality is not so restrictive as to single out one rational response to each evidential situation. How should I react to my friend's belief in this case? Unquote. So Christensen says there's two things that I could do. I should either, one, think that my friend hasn't given the right weight to explanatory desiderata, or two, move my belief in the direction of hers. Christensen thinks it feels uncomfortable to do neither, right? If I just agree to disagree, especially in this case where there's a patient's welfare that depends on what we're going to do, agreeing to disagree doesn't leave us with kind of a set of actions that we can take. It feels like we sort of have to either say that one of us is a little bit more wrong than the other, and so move more toward the right view, whatever that is, or we both have to move toward each other's views. So here's another way to put it. There's a desideratum of accuracy. We want to be as accurate as possible, especially when it comes to a patient's health. And if I think of it that way, I might ask why I think that my belief is more accurate than my peers. Why do I, as a doctor, think that my credence is more accurate than my fellow doctors? A question you could ask, given the material we discussed last week on, permissivism about epistemic standards and epistemic conclusions, why not be a permissivist? Why not say that maybe both of our responses are rational responses to the evidence and they're just as good and, from my perspective, there's no good reason to discount any one of them. Why not that as a reason for live and let live? Here's another quote from Christensen. Quote, "It seems to me doubtful that one can invoke a permissive notion of rationality to dismiss the significance of the opinions of otherwise rational people with whom one disagrees. Interestingly, the live and let live attitude, despite its initial open-minded flavor, ends up allowing an implausibly closed-minded attitude toward the beliefs of others." Unquote. So Christensen is worried here that if we're just permissivists, if we just say, okay, you think that, that's cool with me, and I think this, that's cool with me, so we're cool, right? It's in a way, for Christensen, discounting a bit too much your own view, because now I have sort of committed to the idea that you're just using different standards than me. It's not even compatible with my view, and so there's nothing that your view can do to influence mine. That's Christensen's worry. Now, ask yourselves, is that a good criticism? Is that a bad criticism or worry? Is there more to follow up on here? What do you think? What does seem clear is that if you're a permissivist, it does give you reasons not to move your own view toward the other person's necessarily. All right, so let's think about some cases that Christensen thinks motivate conciliationist thinking. Call this first one the restaurant case. It's a problem of disagreeing about math, okay? So, quote, "Suppose that 5 of us go out to dinner. It's time to pay the check. So the question we're interested in is how much we each owe. We can all see the bill total clearly. We all agree to give a 20% tip, and we further agree to split the whole cost evenly, not worrying over who asked for imported water or skipped dessert or drank more of the wine. I do the math in my head and become highly confident that our shares are $43 each. Meanwhile, my friend does the math in her head and becomes highly confident that our shares are $45 each. How should I react upon learning of her belief?" Unquote. So we've all been there. For some reason, doing math in restaurants is really hard for all of us. There's a mathematician joke about it. Mathematicians are notoriously bad at restaurant math for some reason. But Christensen just thinks the answer here is really obvious. I should lower my confidence in my own conclusion. If I think it's $43 each and you think it's $45 each, I should be uncertain that I've done it right. There's sort of nothing especially distinguishing your math from my math. And so maybe both of us should just go over our work again and see what the reason was why we came up with a different answer. So now think of this other case, call it forecast. It's going to be a case in which the evidence isn't decisive in the first place. So not a case like the math case where it seems like there's one unique answer that should be decisive, but a case in which the evidence might not lead to a unique answer necessarily. So, quote, "Suppose I'm a meteorologist who has access to current weather data provided by National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Weather Service, and so forth, and that I have learned to apply various models to use this data in making predictions. To make this less like the restaurant case and more like many cases of real-life disagreement, let us suppose that applying the models is not just a matter of clear-cut calculation. Say it involves similarity judgments. After thoroughly studying the data and applying the various models I know, I come to have a 55% level of credence in rain tomorrow. But then I learned that my classmate from meteorology school, who has thoroughly studied the same data, knows the same models, and so on, has arrived at only a 45% level of credence. We may even suppose that we have accumulated extensive track records of past predictions, and she and I have done equally well. We might have been scored by a Breyer score on our probabilistic forecasts or asked to answer yes or no questions and scored for percentage correct. That's how we would have found out. Should I take her opinion into account and reduce my confidence in rain? Well, Christensen just thinks that I should revise my belief. Why not? It seems easy enough to do. We have no reason for believing any one of us made a mistake. We're epistemic peers. There's symmetry here, so why not conciliate? Why not move our beliefs so that they're more similar, our degrees of confidence? So these cases for Christensen illustrate the credibility of conciliationism. These are both cases in which we think, yeah, someone disagreeing with you, that might be a reason for you to revise your belief. So now let's look at some objections to conciliationism, some reasons to think that maybe conciliationism isn't so great. So here's Foley from 2001. Foley thinks that disagreement is a defeat of credibility. If my friend reaches what is, to my mind, the wrong conclusion, that's reason to believe that my friend has made a mistake. So previously, I thought my friend was doing good, was my epistemic peer, but now she's disagreeing with me about something that I'm pretty confident in. For Foley, there's an asymmetry that's been introduced, and the asymmetry is now they look suspicious to me. There's a reason to think they've made a mistake. Kelly, who we talked about last time, thinks a similar thing. Why think that the asymmetry here disfavors my own opinion? Like, why should I revise my belief rather than my peers, right? If one of us made a mistake, but I know my own reasoning, why should I discount my own reasoning as opposed to discounting theirs? So Foley and Kelly are both of the opinion that you should remain steadfast, that actually you should now think that it is my peer that has made a mistake. Now, Christensen replies the following. So Christensen says, wait, but asymmetry needs to be something other than my own reasoning being my own, right? What's so special about me? If there is an asymmetry, how could I be sure that it's on my part that the asymmetry is arising? Suppose that we each have watches, for example, and suppose that the watches indicate a different time, but like we've previously known each of them to be reliable, but as a matter of fact, they're like 5 minutes off or 10 minutes off or something. Just because one of the watches is my watch doesn't mean that I shouldn't revise my own beliefs about what time it is. But Kelly responds that the first person case isn't neutral, like the third person perspective. From my own perspective, my own reasons are not neutral for me, right? I have assessed them. They are in my possession. They are in my understanding or something. They have been subjected to my rational, deliberation. They're not in the same position for me as somebody else's reasoning and somebody else's rationalization and somebody else's decision making. So because the first person case isn't neutral, that's what gives me reason to hold steadfast. And Christensen responds, well, why say that it's different in the first person case? Like, he's just not that compelled by this reasoning. We should think that each reasoner is symmetrical if they are, in fact, epistemic peers. I shouldn't prioritize my own first person perspective over my peers. I can't suddenly think that my peers' reasoning is more likely to be mistaken if previously I was according them, epistemic peer status. If I was previously according them some epistemic peer status, I should continue to do so until I am given additional reason to believe otherwise. So the mere fact that we disagree isn't more reason to think that they're wrong than that I'm wrong. It's still symmetric. All that it's evidence for is that one of us is wrong, but not that it's specifically my friend or it's specifically me. So now Christensen introduces rough principles for assessing disagreement. Like how should we think about disagreement epistemologically at this point? How should we evaluate them? Well, principle number one, we should assess disagreements in a way independent of my reasoning. So actually, while Kelly, for example, thinks that my own reasoning is its own basis for, in a sense, discounting the significance of someone's disagreement because it's not evidence pertinent to my own rational reasoning process. Actually, Christensen thinks that I should assess disagreements in a way that's independent of my own reasoning because it is actually evidence about something that might have gone wrong with my reasoning. And so if I'm going to count or discount the disagreement as evidence, it's got to be on the basis of other kind of higher order considerations, something indicating something to me about your state of rationality. And we'll go over a case study that Christensen thinks helps us think about this. The second principle for assessing disagreement goes like this: to the extent that the assessment provides reason for me to think that the explanation in terms of my own error is as good as the one in terms of my friends, I should move my belief toward my friend's belief. So if the evaluation of the disagreement gives just as good a prediction that my friend is wrong as that I am wrong, like both of them could be good explanations for what's happened, those are the cases in which I should conciliate. Like the math case makes it obvious. If, we disagree by a couple dollars about what the split of the bill should be, and we have no additional reason to think that you made a mistake or that I made a mistake specifically, then I should move my belief toward your belief. We should move to conciliate, because the disagreement evidence is neutral with respect to which specific person is mistaken. So here's a case study to think through the first of our rough principles, that I should assess disagreements in a way independent of my reasoning. Call this extreme restaurant case, a clear case where somebody has made a mistake. And here's a quote. Consider an admittedly unrealistic variant on the restaurant case in which my friend becomes confident that our shares of the check are $450, quite a bit over the whole tab. Here, I think that I need not significantly reduce my confidence in my $43 answer or raise my very low confidence in the $450 answer. I think it is initially far from clear that my reasons for selectively suspecting my friend to be in error are truly independent of the reasons on which I base my own belief. If asked why I think my friend is wrong, I'd naturally say something like, well, $450 just can't be right. It's higher than the whole bill. But this is exactly the reason I'm so confident that $450 is false. So the puzzle is, why does it seem right to discount my friend's belief in this extreme restaurant case, but not in the regular restaurant case we looked at earlier? Basically, is the explanation for why in this case I shouldn't conciliate that I had really high confidence previously that the bill wasn't $450? No, because if we think about a lottery case, for example, one in which, I'm thinking about whether this lottery ticket is going to win, my confidence before the lottery is run is really low in any one ticket that it's going to win. But that's not what determines whether or not it makes sense to discount evidence that comes in later about what ticket won. So it's not my prior confidence that's the explanation for why I get to discount the $450 assessment of the bill. So Christensen says that what does make it rational for me to discount this particular mistake is that it's based on what is reasonable to believe. It's based on common sense checking or something like that. So the best explanation of the disagreement in this case, common sense tells us, is that my friend made an error. Common sense math kind of suggests that $450 is not within the realm of a reasonable answer for the question. And it's that kind of boundary of rationality that tells me that I am okay discounting my friend's disagreement in this case. Not that I was previously not very confident that it could be $450, although the two are related. And you might ask me, why is that important? Why is that detail important? Well, it matters a little bit because we want to know what it is that does motivate us to discount cases where someone disagrees with us, because Christensen isn't of the opinion that we always have to conciliate, merely that most of the time we need to conciliate, and there will be some exceptions, cases where, like an extreme restaurant case, it is very clear to me that somebody has made mistakes in their rational processing. So it's only in those cases where I have access to information that my friend is messing up, in addition to the mere fact that they disagree with me, that it'll matter. So like this gets us our principle that I should assess the fact of disagreement in a way that's independent of my own reasoning about the case. In this case, the independence is coming from my notion of basic math, which moves beyond the specific math that I used to split the bill in this case. So Christensen says, sometimes my friend's error is reason to hold on to my belief and not change my belief. But the reason to favor a belief must be independent of my reasoning. So as in extreme restaurant case, it's not that my priors rule out the bad answer, but that the answer itself indicates a reasoning mistake. And it's important to compare the likelihood of mistake. So if the likelihood of mistake is very high given the answer, then that's a reason to discount the fact of their disagreement on my own opinion. So now think about this other test case. So it's a problem of different standards of evaluation in this case. Here's a quote: "Consider a variant on the doctor case discussed above. Once again, let my initial credences in diagnoses A and B be 65% and 35% respectively, and my friend's credences the reverse. And let us both feel equally clear-headed, confident in our reasoning, and so on. This time, however, suppose I know from extensive experience that my friend's reasoning tends to be just a little more reliable than my own, just a little. On which diagnosis should I base my emergency treatment? I think I should go with B, even though I directly feel the pull of only my own reasoning. If this isn't sufficiently clear, think about what you would want me to do if you were my patient. And the reason I should base my treatment on B is surely because it's now rational for me to have a bit more confidence in B than in A. In other words, if my friend's reliability is just a little bit better than mine, I should more than split the difference with her. But if I should move closer to her initial belief than to mine when she's just a bit more reliable, there seems little reason to deny that I should split the difference evenly when we're fully peers." Unquote. So Christensen is saying, like, if you think about the medical disagreement case where me and my fellow doctor are symmetrical, suppose that you didn't know what to say in that case, right? Maybe you shouldn't split the difference, maybe you should hold steadfast or something. If you change it so that now we have information that my friend is slightly more reliable than me, Christensen thinks that I should more than split the difference. That is, I should move my belief much more toward theirs because now I have reason to believe that they're more reliable than I am. If I'm inclined to do that in the case where they're more reliable, why am I not inclined to at least split the difference in the case in which we're equally reliable? That's kind of the pressure. If you think that deferring to someone with slightly more expertise than you or slightly more reliability than you makes sense, then there should be some intuition as well about deferring to someone who's equally reliable as you or equally accurate as you or equally as rational or equally as intelligent, or so replace it with your favorite kind of equally or your favorite kind of symmetry. So Christensen thinks that's a reason to hold on to the second principle. So if the explanation of the disagreement is the same in both cases, then I should move my belief towards my friends. Christensen thinks that when there are symmetric explanations from epistemic peers, we should split the difference. But when we are asymmetric, we should more than split the difference. Another thing that he notes is that we should adopt a semi-detached first-person perspective. So we shouldn't over-prioritize our own perspective. Insofar as there's symmetry, we should kind of try to balance away from our own perspective to take seriously the perspective of someone we take to be our epistemic peer. And Christensen says, because we're rationally imperfect, we can't hold ourselves to standards only appropriate to rational beings. The mere fact of disagreement, he says, cannot show that I am the one who must have the epistemic edge. Here's a further quote on the ideal and non-ideal rationality question. Quote, "The ideal requirement to take account of one's epistemic peers' contrary judgments is really just a special case of the more general rational requirement to take into account evidence of one's own possible error. Yet, there is undeniably something odd about holding that in the case where I have managed to arrive at the belief best supported by the original evidence, rationality requires me to abandon it. And this is linked to a structural oddity of rational self-criticism that is worth pausing over. It seems clear that an ideally rational intellect that knew for certain that it was ideally rational would have no reason to defer to the opinions of others who were equally informed, no matter how numerous. So, considered at a certain high level of idealization, how would an ideally rational intellect think? It is attractive to see actual disagreement as a shallow contingent matter, with no bearing on what it is rational to believe. But I think that this cannot be the right way to think about our present problem. Our problem gets its purchase precisely in our recognition that we're fallible thinkers. Our problem is how to deal rationally with the fact that we're liable to fall short of ideal rationality. In a way, we're asking, what's the ideally rational response to evidence that I'm not ideally rational? Unquote. So Christensen is kind of saying, if we were ideally rational agents, then holding steadfast would make sense in every case, especially if we knew we were ideally rational, because there wouldn't be any possible agent that could do better than us unless they had more evidence than we did, which is different from being ideally rational. But in a case where we have the same evidence, there'd be no reason anytime ever to conciliate with someone. But Christensen says, because we know we're not ideally rational agents, because we know we fall short of the ideal of rationality, we should conciliate. Because when there is disagreement, it's an indication that maybe this is one of those situations in which we are failing the ideals of rationality. It's evidence about our rationality in a way. So he thinks the higher order evidence status of disagreement is actually kind of crucial to our total epistemic project of trying to be the best rational thinkers we can. That's why he thinks that it's an opportunity when somebody disagrees with us to revise our beliefs, to do better epistemically. So we've given our case for conciliationism. Now, suppose that you were last week really persuaded by permissivism, and now you're worried that maybe permissivism and conciliationism aren't friendly to each other. So let's ask that question. Does permissivism evaporate conciliationism? Is being a permissivist a reason not to be a conciliationist? Christensen thinks not. So even if you think that there's a few responses permitted to a body of evidence, a few different conclusions you can reach in response to a body of evidence rationally, maybe because you have different epistemic standards, Christensen thinks that if our beliefs were to be far enough apart or something like that, they might still bear on one of us making a mistake. Because even for permissivists, there's usually like a range of permissible responses to the evidence. It's not like there's like an infinite spectrum of possible responses to the evidence. Most permissivists think that, you know, there are requirements on what responses you can give based on your standards or something like that. So there will be a range of responses that are allowed. So if our disagreement ranges like quite wide, we're like quite separate, for Christensen, that will still be a place where you can be a conciliationist. Like if you're all the way over here and I'm all the way over here, even if I'm a permissivist, that might be reason to think one of us has made a mistake. Now, one question maybe we can ask Christensen is, what about the cases where we know the disagreement is due to our having different standards? How do we conciliate in those cases if our beliefs are really, really far apart from each other, or our degrees of belief are really, really far apart from each other because our standards are so disparate? How would I go about conciliating in such a case? Right? Like, I don't know. What do you think he would say? In sum, we found some reasons to be conciliationists. Christensen has argued his case. He thinks that, you know, disagreement is evidence about our own adeptness at solving problems and answering questions and making decisions. And it's because we're not ideally rational agents that disagreement is a really important kind of evidence for us as epistemic agents. So here's his conclusion from his paper, and I quote, "In general, I think it's true that if those who work in poor epistemic conditions were more epistemically rational, there would be less disagreement, and many positions would be held with less confidence. So there may well be important epistemic benefits to certain patterns of irrational belief. But I would argue that the patterns of belief are no more epistemically rational for all that," unquote. So let me pause here. When we're thinking about disagreement, maybe sometimes it's like hopeful for some people not to be conciliatory. You know, you make more progress if you've got some people who are really, really stubborn and really want to pursue their avenue of inquiry. So maybe there are some disadvantages to disagreement that are pragmatic disadvantages. A question we can ask is whether those pragmatic disadvantages outweigh the epistemological advantages that Christensen is motivating for conciliationism. He thinks that it's just going to be super clear that in areas where we have poorer quality of evidence, these poor epistemic conditions, will be more liable to making mistakes and more liable to disagreeing heavily with each other. Like, for example, in philosophy, we're working in very impoverished evidential conditions in philosophy. And so we can expect that disagreements will be more distant, right? The opinions will be more distant from each other. And for that reason, Christensen thinks it's actually more important to take seriously disagreements as opposed to less, even if perhaps it has some impractical upshots in some cases. So here's another final quote to close us off. Quote, "This would, of course, have some unwelcome consequences. It seems obvious to me that in philosophy and in certain other disciplines as well, even the best practitioners make mistakes pretty frequently. And if one is part of a discipline whose methods are so clearly vulnerable to error, should not one take this as powerful reason for using precautions against unfounded confidence? It seems to me that such precautions, when available, are a good thing. The fact of disagreement is old, but bad news. It is bad because it indicates the relatively benighted conditions under which we work. But adjusting our beliefs in the direction of those peers with whom we disagree should be welcomed as a valuable strategy for coping with our known infirmities. After all, I want my own beliefs to be those best supported by the evidence. So if the beliefs of other decent yet imperfect inquirers turn out to serve as partial checks against my falling short of this goal, that strikes me as being pretty good news." Unquote. So beautiful final words from Christensen. I would love to hear your opinions about what you think. What do you think about disagreement? Do you disagree with Christensen on disagreement? Or do you think he's made a good case for the role of disagreement in our lives and how we should respond to disagreement? An important follow-up question here, which is something that came up in our discussion session, is, all right, suppose that I'm pretty swayed by conciliationism. Somebody disagreeing with me is a reason to discount my own view. But now suppose that I'm I don't know, in a minority position where I tend to be taken less seriously than people who are in fact my epistemic peers. Or suppose that I'm in an unlucky environment where a lot of people around me are really wrong and I'm not. Maybe there are special reasons why I'm not wrong. Maybe you can think of a moral case where people around you are just deeply morally mistaken and you're the person who feels like, you've thought very carefully about the issue and you were torn for a while, but now you've actually come to the conclusion that people around you must be wrong. Are you justified under certain conditions to hold steadfast to your own belief, even if you're not in a position to claim that you're more of an expert than your epistemic peers, even if you're not privy to all of the sources of their rationality, even if they are actually in the majority? What do you think about this as a strategy for a steadfastness response? Do you think that there's a way to conciliate between that steadfastness instinct and conciliationism? I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you and have a good night. See you next time.